Thanks, that was great. My name is Izzy Kornblatt. Jason Tang is here, but he is not going to be speaking. Not feeling up to it. There's a mic. Is that a little better? All right, my question to all of you is, who knows what this building is? Yeah? It's not the Salk Institute, but it is by Louis Kahn. Anyone know? What do you guys think this has to do with Philadelphia? Bricks. And industrial mills. This is a classic Philadelphia school building. So first I want to identify the Philly School, then I'll talk about how it can inform Philadelphia's future. The Philadelphia School was an architectural movement that challenged dominant European modernism as found in New York and Boston. The school was centered around Penn and in many ways Kahn, who's shown teaching here, and it happened in the context of Philly's industrial architecture. Philly School architects some of them are very well known, but the movement as a whole is not well known, in part because they've kind of played themselves up as individual geniuses and not given much credit to the local culture. But an entire following generation of architects copied these Philadelphia School architects' style, so they're incredibly important. When Jason and I organized our Philadelphia School exhibit here at the Center for Architecture, we suggested that the Philadelphia School was brought about by these three themes. The first is an attention to context. Philadelphia School architects saw their projects as individual small pieces to be fit carefully into existing places. They did so through contrast and similarity. They also emphasized city planning. They regarded the city as kind of a bigger system which could be broken down and analyzed. Most revolutionary was Denise Scott Brown, who made the map of Las Vegas on the right and argued that suburbs were as important a form as cities were now. She sort of democratized planning in so doing. She also fought against the South Street Expressway in Philly. Third was a willingness to show how buildings were made, to build buildings that are quite obviously made of separate parts, much like the industrial machines that these architects would have been familiar with when they were growing up. A great example is the separation of the chimney from the facades of these buildings, kind of exposing an industrial element, a building system, and making it a dramatic piece of the building. So what did this school come from? Well, there was in fact an earlier generation of industrially influenced architects who trained and paved the way for the Philly School. When you put the buildings side by side, I think the influence is obvious. That's a Venturi Scott Brown building at the top next to John MacArthur and Wilson Eyre with Mitchell Jergola. The larger sense of the building as machine comes from Philly's industrial culture and first shows up in Frank Furness. Importantly, this architecture is connected to a cultural moment. It's not just a product of theorists and architects. But that means that by the time the culture dies, the Philly School goes away with it. The architecture really follows the culture. So this is the 1990s, really Philly's economic nadir, and suddenly the Philly School feels irrelevant. Venturi Scott Brown, the last big Philly School firm, gets the biggest commission of their careers taken away from them and given instead to Raphael Vignoli, who was seen as kind of representing the future, representing the iconic building. It was a big blow to Philly architects, and since then, the biggest commissions in Philly have kind of all gone to people like Norman Foster from out of town. What's left are a few Philly School firms that are still doing what they've always done. That's VSBA, even though Venturi and Scott Brown aren't there anymore. And there are newer firms like Ernie McHenry, who have kind of been influenced by the Philadelphia School. But there aren't as many people as there used to be, and it's not groundbreaking anymore. I think the central thing that's changed is that what we value in architecture is very different than it was in the 1970s. These are two buildings that were on the same site. One was torn down to make way for the other, and they kind of illustrate the difference between the Philadelphia School and contemporary architecture. Philly School architects haven't really evolved to design buildings like Tyne and Williams, so they haven't been able to compete. Instead, they've been relegated to designing everyone's favorite architecture, these developer buildings that don't have a lot to do with the city's history, and when they do, they're sort of, you can see that one in Old City is more an imitation of history than a kind of a new take on it. I think that's something really concerning. So who gets the big commissions in Philadelphia now? As I was saying, there's Norman Foster, there's Raphael Vignoli, there's Weiss Manfredi. What this really represents is that when people want progress, when they want to represent something having to do with the future of the country or the wider cultural moment, they can't look to architects who are here. And I think that reflects a lot about our local culture. Where innovation happens now tends to be places like LA, where a unique geography and kind of media-based culture have produced what may be termed its own kind of school, including some of today's top architects. There's Frank Gehry, Neil Denari, Eric Owen Moss, people associated with the Southern California Institute of Architecture. Why did that happen? Well, I think it's the culture again. It's not about the architects. The city's growth LA's growth and position on the cutting edge of media culture over the past 40 years has made it the central place. Tokyo and LA have also become these kind of centers, Tokyo and New York have also become these centers of architectural innovation. The media city is much more relevant than the industrial city. But this growing media culture doesn't mean that regional culture, local architecture is dying. This is actually a quote from Robert Venturi, and that's a detail from his design for a resort in Japan, where he shows that there can be an interplay between global media culture, pop art representation, and the elements of a historical city. One thing that I think is a serious threat to Philadelphia becoming a dynamic city is a sort of ideology of historicism, the fetishization of Philadelphia history that stops the natural urban cycle of demolition and rebuilding and suggests that our future should be as a sort of sanitized pseudo-European tourist destination. Philly school architects demolished old buildings to build their buildings, and we have to keep doing that now. Another concern I have is that architectural schools have become more focused on the theoretical and the global and have focused much less of their educational resources on explaining regional culture and regional history. There are a lot of great architects and projects that come out of Penn Design, but I wish they knew more about the Philadelphia School. How then do we move forward? We need to start with the lesson that architecture follows the wider culture. So if we want to develop cutting-edge contemporary architecture here, we need to embrace the economy of the future. These sorts of projects are a start, but other cities, Boston, Denver, Seattle, are ahead of us. One unique asset that we do have is our physical environment, including our industrial legacy buildings. It may be in buildings like this, not in giant skyscrapers, that the architectural culture of the future is born. Philadelphia School architects would be proud. Thank you.